I can turn. Yeah. Okay,
I'll give you this to you in case somebody else joins.
so people that are online,
I'm
I hope you can come by and pick one of these up tonight. And people here, I hope you'll just save it for a little while, but Paul, whatever you've decided is a good descriptor. And then next week, when you're not here for Halloween, I will put them all on a big board and we'll laugh at them. Hopefully we'll have time to share a little tonight too.
How about a Wordle t-shirt?
A what? A Wordle t-shirt?
One of those, you put all those words into some software and it makes a big pattern, and a lot of people have made t-shirts or whatever off of it.
Oh. Well, that's a possibility. Who does
Just for
that?
fun.
Yeah. But do you know somebody that does that? A company or what?
I could probably come up with something like that.
Okay. Any questions going into this?
How long do we have to wait to do this?
Well, until you are just sure. I mean, we're introducing more material tonight. You might change your mind.
Oh,
You never know.
okay.
So, yeah, I would like them back by Sunday so that I can put them together. But yeah, we're not meeting that week, so I have to keep reminding myself of that. We have a blank spot in there. So you have some time, but don't forget to do it, which means for me, do it now. Oh, yeah. So right into the PowerPoint. Fortunately, Jody was around to help because the connections weren't as expected back there. I don't do well with unexpected. So sharing screen. So Paul the Grumpy Apostle. I call this one Grumpy to get along a long time ago. And because I had read an article about the thing where Paul is quoted as saying there's a law that women have to not speak in assembly. And so this article pointed out that there is no such law in Torah. It does not exist. And so I got to exploring on that and found many other things. Okay, so Torah doesn't suggest that men are superior, so we can't completely dismiss it, but here's my quote to irritate and confuse. And you're going to see way too many words up here tonight. I'm sorry about that. PowerPoint should not have that many words, but you have something there that Corinthians sheet. It's probably about in the middle of the sheet. So you can refer to it and not try and read all that off the board. But main thing here, they should be subordinate, as the law also says. So, that's kind of upsetting to me anyway. Anyway, we'll get back to that in just a little bit, but first a review of the basics. Acts is a valuable outline for the early church, but it's not a historically dependable document when it concerns Paul. Paul's letters have the dependable details. He wrote first. Acts followed many years later. And we have to remember too that these were occasional letters that he was writing. Occasional meaning for an occasion. Are the people arguing about whether women should be silent in church? So Paul would try and find an answer to their problem. Paul's letters were the first written documents that ended up in the New Testament. But we also need to remember that he didn't know he was writing scripture. He was writing letters to congregations that needed advice. And we also talked about there's 7 of these 13 letters definitely written by Paul. The authentic ones are sometimes called. Both the letters to the Corinthians, Romans, Galatians, Philippians, first but not second Thessalonians, and Philemon. There are some in between there, like Colossians, but definitely written after Paul. Definitely, according to most people that have studied this, are First and Second Timothy and Titus. So, opinion. Does the author matter? Luther said, if it ended up in there, God must have wanted it to be there. Of course, he didn't like Revelation or James, but okay, Sue, I saw, yes, it matters.
I think it does. I think it because it's more firsthand experience. It's more that first generation. And I think a lot of the other ones were written by people that were a little bit more removed from it.
Yeah, it's exciting to think of this really early church and getting that started. That is so amazing. They started with so few people, and thanks to Paul and probably a lot of others, by the end of the century, there was an established church and they had some different ideas to bring in. Okay, so look, I did do that as a handout, and we aren't going to spend a huge amount of time on it, but does the author matter? If you look at First Timothy, one of those that was written later, Paul, or whoever is speaking for Paul, says, I don't let women take over and tell the men what to do. They should study to be quiet and obedient along with everyone else. Adam was made first, then Eve. Woman was deceived first, our pioneer in sin, with Adam right on her heels. So at least he didn't admit that Adam was involved. But from an earlier letter from Paul, from Romans, where he really was thinking out his story, his beliefs. Notice the difference there. You know the story of how Adam landed us in the dilemma we're in. First sin, then death. Even those who didn't sin precisely as Adam did still had to experience this termination of life. So that's quite a contrast, really. And Paul is an apostle of contrasts. If nothing else, contrasting with the society around him. Okay, so I didn't print this one out because you probably already know it pretty well. But Galatians 3:28 NRSV version. There is no longer Jew or Greek, there is no longer slave or free, there is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. That's, to me, that's just beautiful, right? But I like what the message says too, because it kind of clarifies something. What does it mean to be one in Christ Jesus? And so they kind of give us this. In Christ's family, there can be no division into Jew and non-Jew, slave and free, male and female. Among us, you are all equal. That is, we are all in a common relationship with Jesus Christ. Also, informative. I don't think it's quite as beautiful, but that's just me. This is called by some the Magna Carta of Paul. He is giving power to common people. Often he's called egalitarian, but that we're all equal really says it better. Okay, so now we're back to Corinthians, the problematic thing. Notice here, and like before, you do have that there. Notice the parentheses there. Those appear in the New Revised Standard Version that we use. And taking out the parentheses, the Message changes women to wives. We'll come back to this later because this is could be kind of important. Wives must not disrupt worship, talking when they should be listening, asking questions that could be more appropriately asked of their husbands at home. God's book of the law, in other words, Torah, which we've already said that doesn't have that law, guides our manners and customs here. Wives have no license to use the time of worship for unwarranted speaking. Do you, both women and men, imagine and I just, the last part I had to put in here. Do you imagine you're a sacred oracle determining what's right and wrong? Do you think everything revolves around you? So, people were getting too outspoken maybe in worship. Like I said, we'll come back for that. But first, to give you a little context. Oh, I forgot this one. Timothy. What that later thing. Let a woman learn in silence with full submission. I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. And there are churches that cling to that today. I think it's kind of a shame because there are a lot of women that can add to teaching and whatnot, but
I'd say that about men.
yeah, men have their problems too. Should we take a vote? I don't think so. Okay, looking for the context. It always helps when you're looking at a Bible verse like that, or a set of Bible verses. What do they call that? Pericope? Pericope? There's a term for a group of Bible verses. It's always good to look for the immediate context. What comes right before that? And probably what comes after it too. And then look for what's in the rest. Paul's writing a letter. Has he introduced a theme? So you need to look around and see what else he said. Which certainly goes along with the Lutheran idea of you take a weak passage and look at it in the light of what you know is good and true. And that's a Martin Luther thing that I find helpful in thinking through, and not just taking something. Proof texting doesn't work very well that way. Anyway, looking for context. First of all, we have that Roman law, and the article that I talked about earlier suggested that probably Paul had to do some going along to get along. That he wanted this church that he was starting, these assemblies that he was starting, to actually survive the Roman Empire, which was not very friendly from the very beginning. They crucified Jesus. I mean, that says it all. So he may have had that Roman law in mind, saying, you know, this is not such a big deal. Let's just go along with this.
Back in those days, weren't the priests pretty much the only educated people, and the people that worked for the priests and wrote for the
Well,
priests? They
the
could read and
scribes were
write?
the, yeah, I'd say the Pharisees were pretty educated. The priests too, the scribes. If you're talking about widespread, reasonable education, probably not very sophisticated, but villages had scribes. So if you wanted divorce papers written up, you could go to this person that could actually read and write.
But were any women doing any of this?
Not
think
before Paul.
I didn't think
No.
so.
I don't know that, but
And,
it
and,
seems unlikely.
and wasn't land always to the first son and stuff like that, and a lot of the.
Yeah, well, you had to divide some of it between the other sons, but yeah, it was patriarchal. There's
Yeah,
no
yeah.
two ways about it.
Yeah,
And if people were clinging to that, you really have to understand. Okay, so you're gonna look at what Roman law might have to do with it. Within the letter, you're gonna look at Paul's message. And then within the corpus, if you look at all the letters of Paul, do they back each other up? Do you find, and you find some things in Romans that, you know, apply to almost all the other letters. Romans, he wasn't writing to a church that he founded, but he was putting together all of his arguments. Then within the letter, we want to look and ask, what really was Paul's attitude to men and women in that relationship? And what were Paul's directions for worship? Because the problematic passage there is talking about worship. So if you would turn to that Corinthians handout. So we have the problematic passage first. And you see the message one. But then we're going to look back earlier in the letter. Paul is kind of, there has been a theme developing here. Not his only theme for sure, but can I have somebody read that? 11:10:1.
Don't, by the way, read too much into the differences here between men and women. Neither man nor woman can go it alone or claim priority. Man was created first as a beautiful, shining reflection of God. That's true. But the head on a woman's body clearly outshines in beauty the head of her head, her husband. The first woman came from man, true, but ever since then, every man comes from a woman.
Mm.
And since virtually everything comes from God anyway, let's quit going through those who's first.
Yeah.
Does that kind of enlighten the whole thing?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, so we had to go a little
Does
further
that
back.
come from the NRSV?
You know, I wish I had put it down here. I don't think so. I think it comes from the message. Would somebody
That's
like
what
to
I'm
read that
thinking.
from NRSV?
Yeah,
Pat, do you have that?
In the NRSV,
Yeah, the 11:10 through 12.
to 12.
Yeah.
For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, or man independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman. But all things come from God.
So does he not go on with that? Let's quit arguing about this.
No.
Okay. Well, I should have put both of them in here. Thank you. So what do you think? This is why we do NRSV, because it is a more dependable translation. It just is.
It's good to read multiple translations.
It's not always an easy to understand NRSV,
right.
so. Helps to pull that in, but I wonder if usually when something like that is said, you'll find it a couple of verses before, a couple of verses after. I did not investigate it closely enough to know that. Open question. But the next part we're gonna look at is on the other side of this paper. The before and after. So we started out with verses 34 through 35 in chapter 14. And so this time we're gonna read 26 through 40. And notice where the insert is. There is where what you find in the NRSV. Some early manuscripts put it at the end after verse 40. So it must have been kind of juggled around for a while. Okay, somebody want to read the first part of that, the 26 through 33?
I can read. So here's what I want you to do. When you gather for worship, each one of you prepared with something that would be useful for all. Sing a hymn, teach a lesson, tell a story, lead a prayer, provide an insight. If prayers are offered in tongues, 2 or 3 is the limit. Then only if someone is present you can interpret what you were saying. Otherwise, keep it between God and yourself. And no more than 2 or 3 speakers at a meeting, with the rest of you listening and taking it to heart. Take your turn, no one person taking over. Then each speaker gets the chance to say something special from God, and you all learn from each other. If you choose to speak, you're also responsible for how and when you speak. When we worship the right way, God does not stir us into confusion. He brings us into harmony. This goes for all the churches, no exceptions.
Okay, so what are we talking about there?
What church should act?
How a church, what do you think the problem was? What problem?
Who was the main speaker?
Were they argumentative?
Who's argumentative? Pat, do you have the heading for that in the NRSV?
Orderly worship.
Orderly worship. Okay, so Corinthians was famous for being disorderly. I mean, it was a disorderly town and they got into trouble. Paul's writing this letter after they'd had some problems that he thought they'd gotten past. So anyway, he wants a little more order in their worship. And he says, I speak in tongues, but that's between God and me. And he's kind of giving that hint that maybe I need to point that out to my son.
So do you think he's talking to men and women, or do you
Oh,
think
yes.
it's men?
No, this is a letter to the church in Corinth. The assembly in Corinth.
I guess I was involved with a church that eventually the pastor and the deacons decided that it was okay for women to give sermons in church.
Mhm.
And some people left the church because of that. And then I have another friend who believes that only women can only teach children or other women. And I'm wondering where they get that. Do they select out?
Yes, probably
Verses.
so. I mean, if you just read First Timothy, that's where you go, John.
We're going into church history.
Right.
Women had just as much power in the church. In other words, they had their own churches in their homes. They gave the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist, to their members. It wasn't until about the 3rd century when the church started getting organized. And of course, it was organized by men. But the men decided to shut out the women in leadership roles. And it became law within the church for generations. And it's true. I used to be a Missouri Synod, and they did not allow women pastors. And the Catholic Church, they cannot become priests. So I mean, it's still a tradition going on. But
Yeah.
that's how it came about, because even Paul writes about Lydia. That's my favorite example, because Lydia had a church in her home.
Right.
And she was doing the communion, she was baptizing. She was the same as any pastor or any priest at that time. And there were others. I'm just using Lydia because it's an example from the Bible. But in the church history, it talks about other women who took leadership roles within the church. But then they were put back in their place about the 3rd century.
So I had gone to this woman's Bible study led by this woman. And then our church was huge. I mean, there were a lot of people. And I met her outside of church, and she said she had stopped going because of that. And I was just shocked. I just couldn't get over it. So
Yeah,
and then when I was doing some reading in Paul, I'm like, I'm confused even more.
well, and
So I
You
don't
have a right to be
understand
confused.
why people can pick select Bible verses and not others.
look
then
at the
that's not-
context. Yeah,
It's not just men and women differences on a lot of things.
Right.
now somebody pointed out, they thought the church at Corinth, the assembly, their church was not really a legitimate word till later, but that Corinthian church had a number of people who had come from a tradition of women worshiping separately from men,
Mm,
but they were brought into the same assembly. They just didn't sit together. And so this person, I read all kinds of papers and stuff, but this person thought that probably these women, they had less education on the average, and they were probably shouting across the church to ask their husbands questions.
oh,
So, yeah, it could be disruptive. So women, be quiet. Ask your husband that question at home. But it's one of these things where Paul's letters are one-sided. We know his answer, but we aren't totally sure of the question,
Mhm.
of the circumstances.
Mhm.
Okay, somebody want to read this last little bit? Or did we already do that?
I'll read it.
Okay,
If any one of you thinks God has something for you to say or has inspired you to do something, pay close attention to what I have written. This is the way the master wants it. If you won't play by these rules, God can't use you. Sorry. 3 things then to sum this up. When you speak forth God's truth, speak your heart out. Don't tell people how they should or shouldn't pray when they're praying in tongues that you don't understand.
Mm.
Be courteous and considerate in everything.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
be polite. Get along. So. Any other comments about that before we go on? I think Anne really has a point there in that some people will leave a church just because it's not the way they were taught that it was supposed to be. And Paul must have come across a lot of that because he was teaching a lot about what people hadn't done before. So pretty big deal.
Well, in the Jews, only men could go to the temple, right?
Well, they had a place for the women. It just-
Outside.
Well, yeah, in the
Wasn't
courtyard or something. There
Yeah.
was a women's place.
But you know,
So-
if you think about it too, you know, with some of the people like that you're talking about, that was the way that they were raised. And so they're gonna have a hard time changing the way they think. And if you put that back into history, then during that period of time, the Jews were raised a certain way and they had a hard time changing as well. So I think it's just a part of human nature to kind of resist that, what you felt comfortable with as a child. Is that one when I was a child? That was.
You know, I was brought up in a Baptist church and it wasn't, oh, what's the term for the really strict Baptist churches? It wasn't one like that at
Mhm.
all.
Mhm.
And I don't, you know, I don't remember any of this controversy being presented with any of it. And so when other people, when you told them you were a member of a Baptist church, you know, they thought, well, you couldn't dance and you couldn't do this and that. And I never experienced that. And so I guess I was surprised to hear that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The way we grow up has a big effect forever.
Are there still churches where the women sit on one side and men the other? I mean, there used to be.
Probably.
I think the Wisconsin said.
Was Wisconsin feel that
I
way?
think so.
I just wondered.
Did you say?
I think of
Wisconsin
Lutherans as
says
being
it's-
so common sense, but, and maybe that is common sense, just not
One church around.
the way I
home,
grew up.
Zion Lutheran, old,
Mhm.
very strict Lutheran congregation. Not only did men sit on one side and women sat on the other, men went in the one door that had the highest steeple and the women.
Is that right?
Oh, why?
Oh.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
great.
those
A
old
lot of
Germans.
tradition, yeah, when you think about that, over the years, so.
Okay. So. When the other part of context is how was Paul treating women?
Right.
In Acts. We're introduced to Priscilla and, oh, what's her husband's name? I should have put Aquila. And she's thought of as the first preacher and teacher that was a woman. And she appears again in Romans and maybe Corinthians, at least one other book.
Mhm.
And it's interesting, she's mentioned 3 times at least in Acts. And when she's the main person, when she gets first billing. So it's Prisca or Priscilla and Aquila. When they're going to their house church, which is no doubt owned by Aquila, it's listed as Aquila and Prisca. So it turns out that way a lot. She had a lot of influence. And Paul gives her credit for having a lot of influence. In Romans, we also have Phoebe, who was a church deacon, and she was the ambassador to Rome. She was the one carrying Romans to the Romans. Junia. Now here's a story for you. Junia, an apostle, and the church in the medieval church changed that to Junius because surely a woman couldn't have been an apostle. So yeah. And so Martin Luther learned Junius. It was that way. And then he also mentions workers, people that have done good work with him. In Romans, there's a whole chapter devoted to greetings. And so Mary Tryphena and Tryphosa worked with Paul. Now there are a lot of other women's names, but I'm not putting them up there because he didn't specifically say what their job was. He gives his greetings to Julia, but we don't know what Julia was about. In Philippians, he had it as Euodia and Syntyche, workers with Paul. But those are the ones where he really points out, these are the people that have been instrumental. And others mentioned that had house churches or one thing or another that you really know were instrumental. Somebody mentioned Lydia. Chloe was the one that asked for help in Corinth. So there were a lot of women that he gave credit to. And they were not silenced. Okay, so you come down to, why is Paul special? Why is his authorship so honored that people clear after his death would want to claim that they were writing in Paul's name? And to me, John had a name for this a couple weeks ago, and I can't remember what he said. His when he introduced himself, he claimed direct instruction from Jesus Christ. In Acts, they say he learned from the disciples, but Paul says no. And he says it again and again. And well, I may not be able to exactly understand that. I don't not believe it. I believe mysticism is a valid path to God. And if Jesus, the risen Jesus, can instruct you, hey, I wouldn't argue. So that carries a lot of weight. He founded all those churches. You know, we don't probably know all of them, but he was probably writing letters every day. The next thing, though, he identified with common people. And I think that is really significant. In Acts, he comes off as very proper, very authoritative, speaking in a loud voice and being a good speaker, convincing people. And in his letters, he says, I don't know why you even listen to me. I'm such a bad speaker. he's kind of humble. Even though he says he's blameless in the law, he considered himself a common person. And he lived his life in Christ. You can see that. And it's something that I think a lot of people, if they get to know Paul, can catch on to. He cared. He made himself vulnerable. This is a guy that cried tears and admitted it. He got let down in a basket, which must have been just humiliating to escape. And he admitted it. He admitted it was humiliating. So there are the main things about Paul. He's relatable. So again, I picked out verses here and didn't give you a copy of these, but much of the time we don't have enough to eat. We wear patched and threadbare clothes. We get doors slammed in our faces. Okay. He's talking to common people that have had that experience. He's even talking to slaves. And this is that vulnerable part. As it turned out, there was pain enough just in writing that letter, more tears than ink on the parchment. But I didn't write it to cause pain. So he's emotional. Sometimes it's angry emotional, but other times there are tears on the parchment. Do you know how I feel right now and will feel until Christ's life becomes visible in your lives? Like a mother in the pain of childbirth. Okay, this is a really big deal. A mother in the pain of childbirth. That's not something a manly man would say. You know, men had an image, and it wasn't talking about childbirth. So there were probably some people that went into shock and left the congregation on that one. But, you know, maybe they changed their mind later. Anyway, he has a bunch of these metaphors that reach women. He's not just talking to men. He's saying things that women can identify with. It's going to come as suddenly, this is talking about end times, as suddenly and inescapably as birth pangs to a pregnant woman. We cared for you the way a mother cares for her children. He was the mother. There's actually a book called Mother St. Paul. She goes a little too much into the metaphors for my taste, but it's an interesting book. You're acting like infants, and he says something about you think you should still be suckling at your mother's breast or something like that, I think. Well then, I'll nurse you since you don't seem capable of anything more. And there are several places where he says, I'll feed you with milk until you're ready for solid food. And in the end, all we had to show for it was miscarriages and stillbirths. Can you see why women would have tuned in? Like, this guy kind of gets me. So finding ourselves in Paul. I was asking Pastor a few weeks ago, I read an article, and there are a lot of them out there that say Paul was queer. That thorn in his side was homosexuality, and he couldn't accept it. He prayed for it to go away. And Pastor Tim said, you know, we can all find something of ourselves in Paul, something to relate to. He is so relatable. So finding ourselves in Paul, yeah, if the thorn in your side, this particular thing that I'd read said it was by a man who was a homosexual, and he just said, that's exactly how I felt. The thorn in his side. Tears, anger, sorrow, being emotional. That's not real manly in his world. And there's something in Romans. What I don't understand about myself is that I decide one way and then I act another. Well, I identify with that personally. But there are others who have said that Paul must have had some mental illness or he wouldn't be talking that way.
Oh,
So, yeah. And then this, I'm just as happy with little as with much. With much as with little. And I'm hoping to get there someday. Okay, those of you online. You don't have. You don't have this, which I hope you will fill out later. But can you come up with something that you would put in that blank now? And has anybody finished theirs here? Well, I asked you to wait till later. Think about it for 2 minutes. Right.
Connie, can you hold that up in front of the camera? I couldn't read it. Thank you.
Was that in front of the camera?
So these are so big. What will you be doing with them?
I'm gonna get one of those big poster board things and
Oh, okay.
if you want to identify yourself, you don't absolutely have to, but put your name on the back because I don't think it's for everybody's consumption. But I would like to share them tonight.
Connie, could you show that again? Because all I saw was Gary's face when you held it up.
Oh
Sorry,
dear.
Gary.
That was a good one.
Tell me when you can see it because I can't see what you're seeing.
Okay, it says Paul the blank apostle. Okay.
Right. Kim Hallquist did
So
this
none of
this
these are
morning
Black.
and
Oh,
we had talked about what should be on there, but she wanted the
color
bigger
so it would
letters.
stand out.
that's what I was just trying to
So it
figure
came out in 2
out.
lines.
I assumed that when I realized, so you
Oh.
did want them in colors, not just
Yeah.
black.
And all these, even the ones with the black caps, I think are colored. So.
That's why I was asking what we're gonna do with them, because it was obvious to me they could be in a different color.
Yeah.
Red ink is that it?
Well, make it so it's readable, but. You all have a spare moment, you should go get something from the refreshment part.
Well, thank you, Connie, for bringing it.
Good stuff.
Connie, if we fill it out, if we go to church and fill one out, where do you want us to leave it?
Well, I think I'll put a basket up there. I have to approve this with probably Kim tomorrow, but behind the secretary's
Hmm.
area.
Okay,
So it's kind of out of the way, but I'll put a label on it.
okay, thanks.
Yeah. Oh, I was gonna mention that to, the, law. And the article I read said, well, that law is not in Torah. But I really wonder, and the message kind of brought that through from the book of God or something like that. I wonder if that person knew that the Torah includes Genesis and the Abraham story and Adam and Eve being told, you will obey your husband. He will be the authority, something like that. So it's in there if you include that part. And they always say that a better word for that, for Torah rather than law, is instruction. We were instructed. So I don't know how much weight that carries, but something to think about. Okay, who's ready to share?
Always the passionate apostle.
The passionate apostle. Okay. I can agree with that one. Who else?
I put Christian trailblazer apostle.
Yeah,
Could you say that again or show me?
Christian trailblazer
Okay.
apostle.
okay, Kyle, you had something?
Mine's almost the same.
He was always encouraging his people. So that's mine.
Yeah, I think even when he was scolding them, he was encouraging them. You can do better.
I put down early Christian teaching apostle. Same with Pat almost.
That's yeah. Well, the teaching is pretty important.
I put the driven apostle. When I think about how much travel and his constant writing, this guy had a, yeah.
Somebody else from online?
I put the concerned apostle.
He must have really thought through this, or, you know, maybe he was just getting a lot of it directly from Jesus. But he was concerned and he knew how to show that concern. Anybody else online right now?
Put down the entrepreneurial apostle. I guess I'm amazed at how much he's accomplished and what he had to work with at that time, as far as transportation and communication.
Yeah,
Or if entrepreneurial is the correct adjective.
he could have made a fortune as a
Yeah.
trader or something. Over
I
here,
went off a
Joe.
little different path and put articulate.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Very.
I wish I could read the Greek. Too late in life for that.
Put down prolific.
Hey. I told you that word 2
I did
weeks ago.
tell him.
You gave that clue to him, because that's what I have, prolific Paul.
Oh.
And I gave you that word so you would know where it came from.
Well, okay. Let's see, Sue?
I put determined. And like you're
Yeah,
driven.
I had that one. That's one of my choices too.
Yeah. John?
I stole your relatable, and
Oh,
I think
that's
part
a
of the
good
reason
one.
is because, and I hadn't really thought about him that way before, about some of the things that you pointed out here
Mhm.
in terms of down to earth and so on. I think maybe that's one of the reasons that he could relate to so many different churches and be their leader,
Mhm.
is because all of these different, I mean, if you think about all the different churches around the Middle East and the different context each one of those churches would be in, and yet he could relate to all of them.
And it's also no surprise because he was relating to so many different people that the message came out a little different.
Different, yeah,
That's true.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, we've got everybody here still online. Kathleen, do you have something?
I put the sincere apostle.
Yeah.
That's good.
What about Lola?
I was thinking about probably the concerned apostle. He was concerned about all of the people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you didn't have to be rich and famous. Let's see, Glenda, did you just switch places on the screen? I lost you.
Oh, well, I had said concern too, one of the first, but I don't know why I moved, but I'm still at the same spot.
It's a mystery. Okay, who hasn't done this? Kathleen.
Everybody there.
I did it. I said sincere.
Okay, so it all ran together after a while. Oh, thank you so much for doing that. And the people that are ready to turn them in, please just leave them on the corner over there. And
I
we'll
liked
get
your
those.
idea of writing it like that. That's neat.
Oh, with the different colors.
Yes, and
That doesn't show.
I thought she said put our name on the back, but my hearing is so bad. Who knows what you said?
Well, I did say if you want to put your name on the back,
Oh, okay.
but
I
yeah,
always have to check because sometimes I don't hear what some people actually say.
I would like to know who they came from, but if you want to keep it private, that's your business.
No, that was okay. I just
Okay,
double checking.
can we say the Lord's Prayer? The time has come. And you all do know that we're not meeting next week.
Right.
That
Halloween.
Halloween takes precedence.
Yeah.
Okay, can we stand for the Lord's Prayer? I love the way it sounds when you guys online come in, just, it's like our echo. Do we echo for you?
Yeah.
Does it go both directions?
No,
Our Father in heaven,
In heaven.
hallowed be your
Hallowed
Thy
be
name.
kingdom come,
Your
thy
will
will
be
be
done.
done on earth as it is
as
in
it is
heaven.
Let's
Give us this day our daily bread.
daily bread.
Forgive us our trespasses.
So we forgive
We
those who
Forgive
sin.
those who trespass against us.
Save us from the time of
Temptation.
trial. Deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom
power and the glory are yours.
and the glory forever. Amen.
I always want to sing some of the old words.
Me too.
I still am working on that.
I can't get that.
I know, it's hard.
I'm going to email back a picture of a word cloud that if you're interested, we could make something like that out of the words that we are gathering. I'll just, so let me know, okay?
Yes, yes.
But it's kind of a neat piece of artwork. At the very least, we could come up with a wall hanging from it.
Thank you. Yes. We will be watching for that.
Okay,
I think I finally
blessed
got
week.
you too.
Was your week there?
They too, Ash. We got the card.
I got the card.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, we had a thank you for being here last week. In the Baptist church that I was brought up in, we always said the Lord's Prayer, but we didn't say this particular Lord's Prayer, so I still have a hard time.
Well, yeah, and then they change it on you.
Yeah.
Okay, I was looking for the mouse. I need to be able to close out
Close
the meeting.
everybody out. There you
Bye,
go.
Glenda.
Bye.
Bye.
He's in quiet.